Let's start. Imagine you are standing in front of the most powerful, wealthiest emperor in the history of the world. You have traveled for 3 brutal years across deserts, mountains, and oceans. You've survived bandits, disease and starvation, expecting to finally find a kingdom dripping in solid gold, silver, and precious gems. You expect to see merchants in the grand markets trading massive, heavy chests of treasure. But instead you see something so bizarre, so completely unhinged, that when you finally return home to tell your people about it, they literally lock you up, mock you, and call you a madman. You watch merchants trading beautiful horses, fine silk, and rare spices, not for gold, but for dirty, fragile little pieces of tree bark. And the craziest part? It works perfectly. The entire empire is booming. This is the story of Marco Polo. He was an Italian merchant, an explorer, and depending on who you ask, a bit of a corporate spy. But more importantly, he was the first Westerner to stumble upon a financial cheat code that would eventually take over the entire planet. He discovered paper money. And the reason the rest of the world refused to believe him, the reason the kings and elite bankers of Europe pointed and laughed at him, reveals a massive glitch in human psychology. It is a glitch that still affects how we view money, banks, and even things like Bitcoin today. To understand why this discovery was so shocking, we have to rewind to the 13th century. In Europe, money was simple, money was heavy, money was metal. If you wanted to buy a cow, you handed over a piece of silver. If you wanted to buy a ship, you handed over a heavy chest of gold coins. This made perfect logical sense to the human brain. Humans are hardwired for physical reality. Gold is shiny, gold is incredibly rare, but most importantly, gold represents physical labor. To get a single ounce of gold, humans had to dig deep into the earth, risk their lives in dangerous mines, and refine the metal using intense heat. The gold itself was proof of the energy spent to acquire it. Therefore, gold has intrinsic value. You can melt it down, you can make jewelry out of it, you can physically bite it to make sure it's real. The idea of trading something valuable, like a house or a horse, for something totally worthless, like a piece of paper, was considered absolute insanity. It went against every basic survival instinct we evolved with. You don't trade a real apple for an imaginary apple. But this system had a massive crippling flaw. Hauling giant chests of metal across Europe was incredibly dangerous. Bandits were everywhere, waiting in the forests to ambush wealthy merchants. And worse, gold was incredibly heavy. A single merchant could only carry so much wealth before the physical weight of the gold literally stopped him from moving. Merchants were being weighed down by their own success. The physical limits of gold were holding back the growth of the entire European economy. Enter Marco Polo. In the year 1271, this young merchant from Venice decided to take the ultimate road trip. He traveled along the famous Silk Road, heading further east than almost any European had ever successfully gone. He crossed the treacherous Gobi Desert, climbed the freezing Pamir Mountains, and navigated through dangerous warlord territories. His final destination? The Grand Court of Kublai Khan, the ruler of the Mongol Empire. At the time, the Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. It was a terrifying, unstoppable superpower that stretched from Eastern Europe all the way to the coast of China. When Marco Polo finally arrived at the Khan's summer palace, he expected to be blinded by the gleam of infinite gold. He expected to see vaults overflowing with the spoils of conquered nations. Instead, he was introduced to the ultimate financial illusion. Kublai Khan had figured out a secret that modern governments use every single day. He realized that money doesn't actually need to be made of anything valuable. Money is just a technology. Money is just a way to keep score. And if you have absolute, unquestioned authority, you can make the score whatever you want. The Khan had created a system that left Marco Polo completely speechless. He wrote in his journals that the Khan had found the secret to alchemy. But the Khan wasn't turning lead into gold. He was doing something much more powerful. He was turning literal tree bark into gold. The emperor's guards would go out and strip the bark from mulberry trees. These were the exact same trees whose leaves were used to feed silkworms. The workers would take the fine white inner layer of the bark, mash it up, press it completely flat, and process it into a distinctive dark paper. They would then cut this paper into neat little rectangles of various sizes, representing different values. But a piece of paper is just a piece of paper. To turn it into money, it needed the magic touch of the state. Multiple high-ranking officials were required to sign their names on the notes. And then, for the grand finale, a chief officer would take a massive imperial seal, dip it in bright red vermilion ink, and stamp it dead center on the paper. The seal of the Khan. But here is the genius part. How do you convince millions of people to trade their hard-earned goods for a piece of stamped bark? Kublai Khan issued an empire-wide decree. He demanded that all gold, silver, gems, and pearls in the kingdom must be handed over to his imperial treasury. In exchange, the government gave the citizens these pieces of stamped tree bark. If you were a wealthy merchant, you would bring the emperor a heavy chest of solid gold, and his appraisers would hand you a lightweight stack of paper in return. Now, you might be asking, Why on earth would anyone agree to this terrible trade? Why give up real treasure for a fragile piece of bark? Well, they didn't have a choice. The Khan attached a very simple, very terrifying rule to his new paper money. It was the ultimate enforcement of what we now call fiat currency. Fiat is a Latin word that means let it be done. It means the money has value simply because the government says it has value. But the Khan didn't just say it, he backed it up with the sword. If you refused to accept the paper bark as payment, or if you tried to trade in gold and silver secretly behind the government's back, the punishment was immediate death. You would be executed on the spot. And it wasn't just for the local citizens. When foreign merchants arrived from India or the Middle East bringing precious metals and jewels, they were strictly forbidden from selling them to anyone except the emperor's designated officials. The officials would confiscate the foreign treasure, hand the merchants paper money, and send them into the markets. And just like that, the greatest financial experiment in history was born. Marco Polo noticed something incredible. Despite the brutal enforcement, the system worked beautifully. Because everyone was forced to accept the paper, under the threat of death, the paper suddenly gained real, undeniable purchasing power. A merchant knew that if he sold his prized horses for a piece of paper, he could take that exact same piece of paper across the empire and buy food, clothing, or a house. The piece of paper had become a bridge of trust. It was lightweight. It was incredibly easy to carry. It couldn't be melted down. And it solved the massive problem of transporting heavy gold across dangerous roads. The entire economy of the Mongol Empire was booming. Trade flourished under the Pax Mongolica, running completely on an abstract hallucination enforced by military might. The Khan had successfully monopolized all the real wealth in the empire, while the citizens happily traded the illusion of wealth. After spending years in China, serving in the Khan's court, Marco Polo finally returned home to Venice. He had seen wonders that no European could even imagine. He wrote a massive, detailed book about his travel. He detailed the incredible cities, the advanced technology, the postal system, and the massive armies. But when he got to the part about the money, the Europeans stopped reading. They thought it was a complete joke. Imagine Marco Polo standing in a grand European court, surrounded by kings, nobles, and wealthy bankers. He pulls out a flimsy piece of dark paper with a red stamp on it and says, "In the East, the greatest empire in the world trades this for castles and silk." The European kings pointed and laughed at him. They mocked him. In fact, his book became known as Il Milione, which translates to the million lies. People thought he was a serial exaggerator. They thought his mind had been broken by the long, exhausting journey. To the European mind, trading tangible, heavy gold for a piece of paper was the definition of utter stupidity. They couldn't grasp the concept of abstract value. They were trapped by their own biology, unable to see past the physical object in front of them. Because a piece of paper didn't require thousands of hours of dangerous mining, their brains rejected it as worthless. They rejected the concept of paper money for hundreds of years. They continued dragging heavy chests of gold through bandit-infested forests, paying massive costs for security, convinced that they were the smart ones. Why were the Europeans laughing? Because they didn't understand what money actually is. Money is not gold, money is not silver, and money is certainly not paper. Money is simply a shared illusion. It is a psychological agreement between two humans that a specific token represents stored time and energy. The physical form of the token doesn't matter. It never mattered, whether it's giant stone wheels on an island, tiny cowrie shells in Africa, or stamped tree bark in China. It only works if we all collectively agree not to laugh at it. The Europeans laughed because they lacked the collective trust to make the illusion work. They needed the physical weight of gold to feel secure. And here is the modern lesson. We still suffer from this exact same psychological glitch today. Look at how people react to modern financial innovation. For a long time, modern paper money was still backed by gold. You could theoretically take a US dollar to a bank and trade it for physical metal. But in 1971, President Richard Nixon officially took the United States off the gold standard. He essentially did exactly what Kublai Khan did. He severed the tie between physical treasure and paper money. The entire global economy was suddenly running purely on trust and government authority. And people panicked. Where is the physical backing? How can numbers on a screen be real? We saw the exact same psychological glitch happen again when Bitcoin was introduced. When digital cryptocurrency first appeared, the financial elites of Wall Street pointed and laughed, just like the European kings laughed at Marco Polo. They called it magic internet money. They said it was backed by absolutely nothing. They demanded physical, tangible assets. But they missed the exact same secret that Kublai Khan figured out over 700 years ago. Value is not physical. Value is trust. Today, every single modern economy runs entirely on fiat currency. The US dollar, the euro, the yen, none of them are backed by gold. They are backed by the exact same thing Marco Polo witnessed in China. The authority of the government, the threat of force, and the collective hallucination of the billions of people who use it. We trade our time, our labor, and our entire lives for little pieces of green paper, or increasingly just digital numbers sitting on a banking app's server. If you want to understand the invisible illusions that control your wallet, your time, and your future, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We explore the crazy, hidden history of money so you can finally understand how the modern financial world actually works. The next time you pull a $20 bill out of your wallet, take a really close look at it. It has no intrinsic value. You can't eat it. You can't build a house with it. It is, quite literally, just modern tree bark with a fancy seal stamped on it. The only reason it works, the only reason it can buy you a meal or pay your rent, is because we have all collectively agreed to play the game. We have all agreed to accept the hallucination. But Marco Polo knew the truth. He knew that the greatest magic trick in human history wasn't pulling a rabbit out of a hat. It was convincing the entire world that paper was exactly the same as gold.